Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing the control of blood pressure and blood volume. Okay, so we've now discussed how important it is to maintain a constant mean arterial pressure. We've also discussed the role of blood volume in determining mean arterial blood pressure. And now what we're going to look at is these feedback control mechanisms that exist for responding to changes in mean arterial pressure. So we're going to begin with the quick one, which is the baroreceptor response, the short-term one. Okay, and we've discussed that in the case that the mean arterial pressure rises too high, the baroreceptor response is to decrease sympathetic stimulation and increase parasympathetic stimulation to the heart to obviously try and raise cardiac output, because decreasing sympathetic stimulation and increasing parasympathetic stimulation will result in a decrease in heart rate and also a decrease in cardiac contractility, and therefore overall a decrease in cardiac output, and that will help to bring mean arterial pressure back down. In contrast, if mean arterial pressure is too low, then the response is to do the opposite of this, so to raise sympathetic stimulation and decrease parasympathetic stimulation to the heart. I didn't bother writing that down, but I said it at the time, and that will obviously raise cardiac output and helps bring mean arterial pressure back up. But in addition, we also have an effect on vascular smooth muscle cells, so we raise sympathetic stimulation to vascular smooth muscle cells surrounding arterioles in tissues such as the skin, the skeletal muscle, or the gastrointestinal tract, which will result in greater contraction of those vascular smooth muscle cells, and therefore vasoconstriction of those arterioles, which will help to raise total peripheral resistance, which will also help to bring mean arterial pressure up. So that's overall what the baroreceptor response is going to do. What, of course, we want to study is how does this happen? So where are the detectors for mean arterial pressure? We'll start with those, and we'll have a look and see that they're in the carotid sinus and also the aortic arch. Then we want to have a look at the transmission of the information that these pressure receptors are detecting. We want to see how it's transmitted to wherever it's going to be transmitted, and we'll see that it's transmitted up to the medulla, which is part of the brainstem. And then we want to have a look at how the response is actually coordinated to change the sympathetic and parasympathetic output to these different areas. So we're now going to study this in a lot more detail. So I'll just get a new fresh piece of paper and then we'll begin. So let me get this nice and straight. Right, so let's begin. So we want to have a look then at the baroreceptor response. Okay, so to begin with then, we want to actually have a look at the baroreceptors themselves. So a baroreceptor, just to start off with the terminology, a baroreceptor is a pressure receptor. It's a receptor for pressure. Okay, so we want to have a look at the things which are actually capable of detecting pressure, the baroreceptors. Now, as I just said, the baroreceptors are located in the carotid sinus and also in the aortic arch. Those are the two main baroreceptors in the human body. The two main sites of baroreceptors in the human body. So what I firstly want to show you is where the carotid sinus is and where the aortic arch is, just to make sure everyone's familiar with that. Go over what these baroreceptors actually are and what they're actually going to be detecting, and then have a look at the baroreceptive afferent neurons and their pathway up to the medulla through the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerves, where, for instance, the ganglions that contain the cell bodies of these neurons actually are located, and also how the central process of these neurons is actually going to make its way into the brain. Okay, or rather into the skull. Okay, so then we'll have a break, and then in the next video we'll actually have a look at the processing in the medulla. Okay, so firstly then, what I want to show you is the sites of the baroreceptors. So the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. I'll start actually by showing you the aortic arch, because we can then use the aortic arch to show you where the carotid sinus is. We can do it in terms of the aortic arch. So the aortic arch follows the ascending aorta. So after the aorta begins, so from the left ventricle, of course, comes out the aorta, Okay, and you have for a while the ascending aorta here, and then it loops round, loops backwards, okay, and turns so that it's going to go downwards. Now, of course, I can't show it going backwards, so instead I'll show it like so, but it's actually going from being at the front of the chest to being at the back of the chest. Okay, so like so, here is the aortic arch, and then it becomes the descending aorta, firstly the descending thoracic aorta, and then the descending abdominal aorta. So this portion here of the aorta, where it's arching round from being the ascending aorta to being the descending aorta, this is known as the aortic arch, and I'll just get rid of that. I want to call this the aortic arch here. Okay, right, so in the wall of the aortic arch you're going to have a lot of these baroreceptors. So this is going to be one of the key sites for these pressure receptors, and of course they're going to be sensing the arterial blood pressure, and indeed they're going to sense systolic pressure and diastolic pressure, and they'll also be able to give information therefore to the medulla about mean arterial pressure. Okay, now to tell you where the carotid sinus then is in terms of the aortic arch, let's have a look at some of the major branches coming off the aortic arch. So there are three major branches coming off the aortic arch. The brachiocephalic artery here, which will give rise to the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery, so I'll draw these on here. So that's the right common carotid, and here is the right subclavian. And then you'll also have the left common carotid here, coming off directly off the aortic arch, and then the left subclavian. Okay, so these are the three main branches coming off the aortic arch. So this one here, this is going to contain both the right common carotid and the right subclavian before it divides. So this is what's known as the brachiocephalic artery. So the brachio, it should all be one word, but obviously I've run out of space here. So this is the brachiocephalic artery. And then the brachiocephalic artery is splitting into the right common carotid artery, and this is the left common carotid artery coming straight off the aortic arch. So these are the common carotid arteries there. Okay, I'll put an S on the end, and in fact I'm going to add a bit of colour onto this to make it more interesting. So we'll have the common carotids in green here. Obviously this is not reflecting the colour of the blood within them, hopefully not anyway. We'll have the brachiocephalic artery in blue here. This is just colour coding to make it look more interesting, like so. We'll have the aortic arch in red, so all of this sort of region, this is all the aortic arch here, like so. Okay, so that's the aortic arch, and now we just need to colour in the subclavian arteries. So we have the right subclavian artery here and the left subclavian artery here. The common carotids are going to supply the head and neck region, and the subclavian arteries are going to supply the upper limbs. So these are the subclavian arteries, and I'll have the subclavian arteries coloured in pink here, like so. So here's the left subclavian, and here's the right subclavian. Okay, so that is the aortic arch with its branches coming off. Now we're going to follow the common carotids up, because the common carotids bifurcate into the internal common carotid and the external common carotid, and the carotid sinus is a dilated portion of the internal carotid. So let's follow up the right common carotid here. So what we're now going to be looking at then is the right side of someone's neck. So if this is someone's neck here, and then their face will be here, so this will be their jaw here, and then their chin, and I won't embarrass myself by drawing the rest of their face, but this is the right side of their neck. Okay, so here then, ascending up in the right side of their neck, they're going to have their right common carotid artery, and then it bifurcates into two at around the level of the larynx, and it's going to bifurcate into the external common carotid, which will go forwards, and then the internal common carotid, which has this dilated portion here known as the carotid sinus. Now the external common carotid is going to supply the external sort of face, whereas the internal common carotid is going to supply the brain, so it's going to go inside the skull. So this is the external carotid here, and this one here is the internal carotid artery. And of course these are both the right ones, you'd also have left ones, so this is the internal carotid and the right internal carotid. And then that dilatation just after the bifurcation of the common carotid into the internal carotid and the external carotid, this then is what's known as the carotid sinus, and it's the dilatation of the internal carotid. So this is the carotid sinus here, and this is going to contain a lot of baroreceptors in its wall. So now what I want to do is show you the nature of these baroreceptors. So what I want to do is I want to take a cross section through either the aortic arch or the carotid sinus, and I want to show you the baroreceptors within the wall of these vessels. Okay, so if I draw a cross section, then you can imagine that this is the aorta, if you like, a cross section of the aorta. So the baroreceptors, they're just going to be nerve endings. So the baroreceptor is just this fancy structure on the end of a sensory nerve that is capable of detecting stretch in the wall of the blood vessel. Okay, it's not capable of detecting pressure, instead it detects stretch. But of course the stretch of in the wall of the blood vessel, that is determined by how much pressure the blood is at. Okay, because of course the stretch, the higher the pressure, the more stretched the blood vessel will be, the more distended the blood vessel will be. Okay, so firstly let me just remind you of the different layers of a blood vessel wall so that I can show you which layer it's specifically in. So here we'll have the endothelial cell layer of the blood vessel. Okay, so these are supposed to be endothelial cells, like so. So I'll give them all nuclei here, and of course they'd all be sitting on a basement membrane. So I'll draw the basement membrane in green here. Then underneath the basement membrane, and I won't label this up, so those are the endothelial cells with the basement membrane underneath them. Then underneath the basement membrane you're going to have a portion of connective tissue known as the subendothelial space, which I will colour in here in orange, like so. Then underneath the subendothelial space you have the internal elastic lamina, okay, which is a layer of elastic connective tissue. And then after the internal elastic lamina you then have the tunica media, and the tunica media is the layer consisting of smooth muscle cells and a lot of elastic tissue. Particularly in the case of the aorta, you're going to have a lot of elastic tissue in tunica media. Now tunica media is bounded peripherally by another elastic lamina, the external elastic lamina. So I will draw the external elastic lamina on in blue as well, because it's, again, elastic connective tissue. And then the tunica media is going to be all of this gap in between. And this is where we're going to find the baroreceptors. They're going to be within tunica media. And just to complete my discussion then of the structure of the artery wall, outside of the external elastic lamina you'll have connective tissue, which will be the tunica adventitia, which will integrate the blood vessel into the surrounding tissues of the body. So I'll just colour this in here in yellow, like so. So that's tunica adventitia. Right, so we've got the important bit though. Tunica media is where the baroreceptors are going to be placed, and all they are is the ending of a sensory neuron. So you'll have lots of little portions here, and then you'll have a sensory neuron like so. Okay, and this structure at the end of the sensory neuron that is going to be capable of responding to stretch in the tunica media, this is what's known as the baroreceptor. So the baroreceptor is just the portion at the end of the sensory neuron. We would then call the sensory neuron a sensory neuron, or we could call it a baroreceptive afferent sensory neuron. So a I've missed off the receptive. Baroreceptive I was about to write. Baroreceptive, and because I'm running out of space, I'll just put baroreceptive afferent, and afferent just means a neuron that's going to come into the central nervous system. Okay, so this is a baroreceptive afferent. So it's just like the notation for nociceptor, where nociceptor means the structure on the end of the neuron that's capable of detecting noxious stimuli, so painful stimuli, and then the neuron itself is called the nociceptive afferent. So the baroreceptor is the thing on the end which is in the tunica media, capable of detecting the stretch of the tunica media, and then it's attached to a sensory neuron, and that sensory neuron is going to be called the baroreceptive afferent. Okay, right, so in the wall of the carotid sinus, which is just a dilatation of the internal not the internal common carotid, the internal carotid. They don't have the word common in anymore. That's the whole point, that it's bifurcated into two. The internal carotid artery, it's a dilatation of the internal carotid artery, so its wall structure is just like this as well, and in the tunica media you're going to have these baroreceptors attached to baroreceptive afferents. Now, these are capable then, these baroreceptors, of generating depolarizations of the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane in response to stretch. So more stretch, okay, more depolarization. So if stretch goes up, depolarization goes up. And then the more depolarization occurs in the baroreceptor, the more likely it is that the baroreceptive afferent will generate an action potential. So this means that you're going to get more action potentials firing. So more stretch, more depolarization occurring in the baroreceptor, therefore more frequent action potentials. So baroreceptive afferents, they encode the information about how stretched the aortic arch or the carotid sinus is in how frequent they are sending action potentials. So if you're getting loads and loads of action potentials coming from this baroreceptive afferent, if you're a little man on the end receiving all of the action potentials, then you will know that that means that mean arterial pressure is quite high. Okay, so these baroreceptor afferents then, they are encoding the information about the arterial pressure in how frequently they are firing action potentials. And indeed, their frequency of firing action potentials will vary with the cardiac cycle. So we know that in reality, the arterial pressure varies with the cardiac cycle over that 0.8 second time scale. Okay, we have systolic pressure, which is when the blood pressure is at its highest, and then we have diastolic pressure just before another beat of the heart when blood pressure is at its lowest. And actually the frequency of action potentials coming down these baroreceptive afferents does vary with the cardiac cycle. It will be highest during systolic pressure and lowest during diastolic pressure. So from the information that you're getting at the end of this baroreceptive afferent, you can work out what systolic pressure is, what diastolic pressure is, and of course you can also therefore work out what mean arterial pressure is. So these baroreceptive afferents, they do encode the information about mean arterial pressure, and they're now going to take it to the brain. Okay, so what we now want to see then is the path that these baroreceptive afferents take to get up to the brain. So these baroreceptor afferents, they're going to be the classic sensory neuron. And by classic sensory neuron, I mean they're going to have this pseudo unipolar structure. So let me just remind you what is meant by a pseudo unipolar structure. So pseudo unipolar means that the cell body of the neuron will be here. So here's the cell body, and then it's going to look as though it's unipolar, and unipolar means that it just has one cell process coming off, so one dendrite or one axon. Now, the reason it's called pseudo-unipolar is that this process is then going to split into two separate processes, like so. So it's cheating. It's as though it's got two processes. In fact, to all extents and purposes, it does have two processes, but they don't directly come off the cell body. Instead, you have only one process coming off the cell body, but then it splits into two. So they are unipolar, but it's as though they're bipolar effectively. So that's why they're called pseudo-unipolar. Okay, so one of the processes then is the peripheral process, and this is the process on the end of which is going to be the baroreceptor. So this is the peripheral process here, like so. And then the other process is going to be the central process, and this is the one that's then going to go into the central nervous system. So this is a peripheral nervous system neuron, this baroreceptive afferent. It is not going to have its cell body within the central nervous system. It's going to have its cell body within a ganglion. And the whole point of me showing you this picture of this neuron is to motivate now the discussion of where are the cell bodies of these baroreceptive afferents. So we have so far seen the baroreceptor, which is on the end of the peripheral process of these pseudo-unipolar baroreceptive afferent sensory neurons. We have not yet seen where their cell bodies are actually located, and we certainly have not seen where their central processes are going to go. What we're going to do for the rest of this video is we're going to see, firstly, into which big nerves these peripheral processes are actually going to go into. So, if we're following from the baroreceptor up, where is this peripheral process actually going to lead us? And then we're going to see where are the cell bodies of these neurons, and then we're going to see how does the central process actually get to the medulla, which is where it's heading. Okay, that portion of the brainstem. And don't worry if you don't know what the medulla is, I will show you. Okay, so firstly, where are these baroreceptive afferent peripheral processes going to go then? Following from the baroreceptor up, where are we going to go now? Well, they're going to go into some very famous nerves. They're going to go into cranial nerves, which are nerves which come down from the head and neck region. Well, not all of them. Some of them stay in the head and neck region, but they're going to go into some of the cranial nerves which actually come down from the head and neck region into the lower portions of the body. Specifically, they're going to go into the glossopharyngeal nerve in the case of the carotid sinus, and the vagus nerve in the case of the aortic arch. So I'd like to now show this here. So I'm going to draw my picture of the aortic arch again, but this time I'm going to add on the cranial nerves that these baroreceptive afferents are going to go into. So bear with me for a moment. So here is the aortic arch, and I'm going to this time try and draw it better so that instead of having lines across the entrance to my blood vessels coming off, I've actually fought it through, and I can actually have them coming directly off this time. Okay, so here we go. Here is the aortic arch, like so. So subclavian artery on the left side, not internal carotid, common carotid on the left hand side, brachiocephalic splitting into the right common carotid and the right subclavian here. Okay, now let me draw the common carotids going up, okay, like so, and then bifurcating into the external and internal. So again, really the external will be going forward and the internal will be going backwards, but because of the fact that I'm drawing this from the front, it's very difficult to show that, so I'm just having them drawn like this. So this is the external, and this of course is the internal, because I've drawn the carotid sinus on the one to the left here. Okay, so here then is the internal common carotid on the left hand side now, like so. Okay, right, with the carotid sinus importantly. So let's just colour in a few of these things then. So here is the carotid sinus, and of course here is the aortic arch. So these are our important bits, and now what I want to do is show the baroreceptive afferents coming out of these areas and going into cranial nerves 9 and 10. Okay, so let me draw on some of the cranial nerves then. So we'll have cranial nerve 9 shown here, and of course for each of the cranial nerves there are really two of them. There's a left one and a right one. So this is cranial nerve, well, these are the cranial nerve 9s. So let me just make sure I get my Roman numerals correct. It needs to be on this side, I believe, like so. So cranial nerves, because they were named ages ago, they're named with the Roman numerals. So this is the Roman numeral for 9, x is 10, then you put 1 to the left to mean take 1 away from 10. Okay, so this is cranial nerve 9. It's got another name. It's known as the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, and you have two of them. You have a left glossopharyngeal nerve, which is this one, and a right glossopharyngeal nerve, which is this one. And baroreceptive afferents from the carotid sinuses are going to be going into the glossopharyngeal nerves on their respective sides. So these are the peripheral processes of these unipolar neurons, which are the baroreceptive afferents. We're going to see where the cell bodies are. The cell bodies are up here. In fact, I might as well draw this. If you go high enough, if you follow the glossopharyngeal nerve right back up to the base of the skull where it's about to enter the skull, and I will show you where it enters the skull in a moment, you get to a ganglion. Again, a ganglion is just a collection of cell bodies that's outside of the central nervous system. When you have a collection of cell bodies inside the central nervous system, that's called a nucleus. A collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system in the peripheral nervous system, that's called a ganglion. So these ganglia are known as the petrosal ganglia, or just the petrosal ganglion on each side. Okay, so let me colour this in then. So we'll have everything to do with the glossopharyngeal nerves then, coloured in green. So here they are, in green here. Here is their petrosal ganglion, which is at the base of the skull. Okay, and I will try to show the cell bodies of these baroreceptive afferents there. So this is supposed to be that single process that comes off the cell body here. Okay, I've tried to show it, of course it's failing a little bit. Here's the cell body, here's that single process, here's the peripheral process going down to the carotid sinus here, and here's the central process which is going to continue on with the glossopharyngeal nerve into the skull and then to the medulla. So this ganglion is outside of the skull. Okay, and the same thing on this side here. So here is the cell body, and then there's the central process going up, continuing with the glossopharyngeal nerve, and we will see that they go in through a hole in the base of the skull, which I'll show you in a moment on another picture, which is known as the jugular foramen. So they're going to go in through the jugular foramen, and again there are two of these. There's a left one here, a left jugular foramen, and a right jugular foramen. So I will outline the jugular foramen, or the jugular foramina is the plural for foramen, in pink here. Okay, right. Now let's have a look at the nerves which are going to carry the baroreceptive afferents from the aortic arch. They are going to be cranial nerve 10s, okay, vagus nerves. And these are going to actually enter the base of the skull through this same foramen, the jugular foramen, and I've missed out the ganglion, how stupid of me. So they're also going to have a ganglion where the cell bodies of these baroreceptive afferents are going to be located, that is going to again be just before it actually enters into the skull through the jugular foramen here. Okay, so the baroreceptive afferents then from the aortic arch are going to send, well, they're going to have their peripheral processes running up in these vagus nerves like so. Cell body in this ganglion, which I'll give you the name of in a moment, the nodose ganglion. Okay, and then central process continuing on with the vagus nerve into the skull, and it will be going to the medulla. Okay, and I could draw the same thing on the other side here, but due to lack of space I won't. So there would be again a right vagus nerve and a left vagus nerve, and the right vagus nerve will be taking baroreceptive afferents from the sort of righter portion of the aortic arch here, whilst the left vagus nerve will be taking baroreceptive afferents from the more left portion of the aortic arch here. Okay, so let's write this down. So it's cranial nerve CN10 this time, and it's also called the vagus nerve. Okay, and this ganglion then, that's again just before you actually enter the base of the skull through the jugular foramen, this is known as the nodose ganglion. Okay, so we'll colour everything to do with cranial nerve 10 then in blue, and the vagus nerve goes substantially further down the body than the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve does not get that far down the neck, whereas the vagus nerve goes right down into the abdomen. Okay, so it's in fact called the vagus. It means the wanderer. It wanders very far from the head. Okay, so there is cranial nerve 10, and that's going to be taking up these baroreceptive afferents and delivering them up to the skull and to the brain, to the medulla. So the final thing then that I want to do in this video is just to show you a little bit further where these jugular foramens or jugular foramina are. So I want to draw a picture of the inside of the skull and show you where the jugular foramens are actually located. So this picture then, what you are going to imagine doing is taking a skull and lifting the top off, and if you've ever had one of those plastic skulls, or indeed a real skull that someone has prepared for medical education, then you can lift generally the top off the skull. So what we are doing is we're taking a transverse section through the skull basically. All of the contents of the skull has been removed, and we're just going to be looking down into the skull. So you imagine you're standing above and you're going to look down, and you've decapitated the top off basically. You've cut off the top and you're now looking down into the skull. So this is the sort of thing you would see. So we're looking down from above. Whoops, that didn't go well, never mind. This is the anterior portion, so your eyes will be here. The orbit will be here underneath this bone here. Okay, so we've gone quite high up, so the orbit will be below, so you'd have to drill through bone to get into where the eyes are. This is the back here. So the way it looks is kind of, to keep it nice and simple, is kind of like this. So you've got the anterior cranial fossa, a space here that's above the orbits. You've then got the pituitary fossa sitting in the middle. Then you've got the middle cranial fossa, fossae rather, here, a left one and a right one, and then the posterior cranial fossa with the large foramen magnum here. So I'll just label up these different portions. So this space here, and it's clearly demarcated by bony landmarks. So this is known as the anterior cranial fossa. These spaces here are known as the middle cranial fossae, because there's two of them. So there's a left middle cranial fossa and a right middle cranial fossa. So this is the middle cranial fossae. Okay, and since I've done the plural, I better put two arrows there. And then this is the posterior cranial fossa here, and I'll just omit the cranial and put posterior fossa. Okay, and then in the middle is the pituitary fossa, where the pituitary gland sits there. So anterior fossa, I'll have this in blue. Middle cranial fossae, I'll have those in pink here, like so. And then finally, posterior cranial fossa, we'll have this in green. So now what I want to show you is where do the jugular foramina actually, where are they positioned, and where are the glossopharyngeal nerves and the vagus nerves going to come out. So the jugular foramen on the left side is here, and the jugular foramen on the right side is here. So these are holes in the base of the skull, and you're going to come out in the posterior cranial fossa, right at the front of the posterior cranial fossa here. So I'll just colour these in here. So these are the jugular foramina here. Left jugular foramina and right jugular foramina. So this is where the continuations of the glossopharyngeal nerves and the vagus nerves into the skull are going to come out. And of course the central processes of our baroreceptive afferents are going to continue on into the skull in this way. And we're going to see in the next video the medulla, which is the place where these central processes are heading, is going to be positioned right in front of where they're coming out. So it's perfectly arranged. Okay, so in the next video we'll start the neuroanatomy and see the medulla.